My name is Evan Brooks. I'm 38 years old, and it's 7:42 on a cold Monday morning. I was standing outside a conference room in downtown Boston, listening to my younger brother explain to a room full of investors why I was the reason his company was about to collapse. The strange part? Half the people in that room believed him. The other half were about to find out the truth. Through the glass wall of the conference room, I could see Ethan standing at the head of the table. Perfect suit, perfect smile. The same confident posture he'd used his entire life whenever he needed people to trust him. On the table in front of him were contracts, financial projections, and a stack of documents with my name printed across the top. My name, attached to a project I had never approved. And that was exactly the problem, because everyone in that room believed I had personally verified the financial structure behind Ethan's company. Except I hadn't. Not once. Not ever. One of the investors leaned forward and asked Ethan a question I couldn't hear through the glass. Ethan didn't hesitate. He answered immediately. And when he said my name, I realized something that made my stomach tighten. He was still using me, still building his entire story on the assumption that I would stay quiet. For a moment, I considered walking away, letting the meeting continue without me. But then something else crossed my mind. Because if I walked away, every lie he had told those investors would remain standing. And once people start making decisions based on lies, the damage can become permanent. So instead, I opened the conference room door, and every conversation inside the room stopped instantly, because the one person Ethan had been blaming for everything had just walked in. And suddenly, the story he had been telling everyone was about to get a lot more complicated. But to understand why my brother was standing in front of investors using my name to hold his company together, you need to go back about 6 months earlier. Back to the moment I realized Ethan's perfect startup was hiding a problem that could destroy all of us. And the truth is, by the time I noticed it, the damage had already started.
6 months before that meeting with the investors, Ethan invited me to dinner. It wasn't unusual. My brother loved celebrating things. New deals, new clients, new ideas. And that night, he sounded more excited than I had heard him in years. "Big things are happening," he told me over the phone. "You should come see what we're building." So that Friday evening, I drove to his office in Cambridge. The building itself looked exactly like every other tech startup office in Boston. Glass walls, open desks, a whiteboard covered in half-erased ideas. But the moment I walked in, I noticed something different. There were people everywhere, not employees, investors. You can usually tell the difference. Investors don't move around an office like they belong there. They move slowly, looking at everything, like they're trying to measure the future. Ethan spotted me immediately and walked over with that same confident grin he'd used since we were kids. "Danny," he said, throwing an arm around my shoulder, "you're just in time." "Time for what?" I asked. He turned me toward the conference room. Inside were 6 people sitting around a long table. 2 venture capital partners, a lawyer, and 3 private investors I recognized from the Boston business community. That's when I realized this wasn't just dinner. This was a funding meeting. "Relax," Ethan said quietly. "They just want to hear the final structure." The final structure. That phrase meant something very specific in the startup world. It meant the investors were close to putting serious money on the table, and Ethan apparently wanted me there for it. I didn't say anything at first. I just sat down near the end of the table while Ethan began walking everyone through the presentation. Slides appeared on the screen. Market projections, growth models, revenue forecasts. To anyone listening casually, the business sounded impressive. But the longer I watched the presentation, the more something started bothering me. Not the idea, the numbers. Because when you spend your career analyzing financial structures, you start noticing patterns. And Ethan's numbers had a pattern I didn't like. Some of the projections were aggressive. Others were built on assumptions that hadn't been verified yet. That alone wasn't unusual. Startups are always optimistic. But then Ethan reached one particular slide, and that's when the room got very quiet. Because the slide wasn't about revenue, it was about risk verification, a section explaining that the company's financial model had been reviewed by a compliance professional, someone with experience evaluating high-risk funding structures. And right there, at the bottom of the slide, was my name, Daniel Brooks, compliance analyst. I felt my stomach tighten, because that line made it sound like I had officially reviewed Ethan's financial structure, which I hadn't, not even close. The investors around the table nodded as Ethan continued speaking. To them, that line was reassurance, proof that someone with experience had checked the numbers, except that reassurance wasn't real. I leaned forward slightly. "Ethan," I said quietly. He paused mid-presentation and looked at me. "Yeah?" I pointed at the slide. "When exactly did I review this?" For a split second, the confident smile on his face disappeared. Then it came back just as quickly. "Relax," he said lightly. "It's just context for the investors." Just context. That answer didn't calm me, because investors don't treat context lightly. They treat it like verification. And suddenly, I understood something that made the situation much more serious than Ethan seemed to realize. He hadn't just mentioned my name casually, he had built part of his credibility around it, and the people sitting around that table were about to invest millions of dollars based on that credibility. The meeting continued, but for the rest of the presentation, I wasn't really listening anymore, because one question kept repeating in my head. How many other places had Ethan already used my name? And, more importantly, how many people believed I had approved something I had never even seen? The answer to that question would show up about 3 weeks later in the form of an email from a law firm I had never heard of before. And that email, that was the moment this entire situation stopped being a family problem and started becoming something much more dangerous.
3 weeks after that dinner, I received an email that wasn't meant for me. At least, that's what it felt like when I first opened it. It arrived early on a Tuesday morning while I was sitting at my desk reviewing compliance reports for a client in New York. The subject line read, "Verification Request, North Harbor Technologies." That name immediately caught my attention. North Harbor was Ethan's startup. For a moment, I assumed it was just some automated message that had been sent to the wrong address, but when I opened the email, the first sentence made my stomach tighten. "Mr. Brooks, we are currently finalizing documentation related to the Series A funding round for North Harbor Technologies. We would like to confirm your professional review of the company's financial risk structure." I read the line again, slowly, because that sentence suggested something very specific. Someone had told the investor's legal team that I had formally reviewed the company's financial model, not casually, not over dinner, formally, which was impossible. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't analyzed their projections. I hadn't even seen half the documents that would normally be involved in a funding round like that. And yet, the lawyer writing the email clearly believed I had. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen for a moment, because there are two possibilities when a law firm contacts you about documents tied to your name. Either someone made a mistake, or someone used your name in a place it shouldn't be. Neither one is good, but the second one can become a serious problem very quickly. So instead of replying immediately, I started searching. That's the advantage of working in compliance. You learn how financial systems leave trails, contracts, authorizations, email chains. Within 20 minutes, I found the first document connected to Ethan's funding round, then another, then a third, and each one contained something that made the situation worse. My name wasn't just mentioned once, it appeared in multiple sections of the investor materials, risk analysis notes, compliance references, even a summary page explaining that the company's financial exposure had been reviewed in consultation with Daniel Brooks. Consultation, a harmless-sounding word, but inside legal documentation, it carries weight. Enough weight that if the company collapsed later, investigators might assume I had approved the structure behind it. Except I hadn't, not even remotely. I picked up my phone and called Ethan immediately. He answered on the third ring. "Hey, Danny," he said casually. "What's up?" I didn't bother with small talk. "Why is my name inside your investor documents?" For a moment, there was silence. Not long, but long enough to tell me he already knew exactly what I was talking about. "Relax," he said finally. That word again, relax, the same word he had used during the presentation 3 weeks earlier. "It's just part of the pitch," he continued. "The investors like knowing someone with compliance experience looked at things. Except I didn't." Another pause. Then he sighed. "Danny, it's not a big deal." That sentence made something in my chest tighten, because people who say it's not a big deal about financial documentation usually don't understand how serious those documents actually are. "Ethan," I said slowly, "lawyers are asking me to confirm that I reviewed your financial structure." The silence on the line became heavier. Then his voice changed. Not nervous, but more controlled. "Just tell them you glanced at it," he said. Glanced at it, like we were talking about a menu at a restaurant, not a multi-million-dollar funding round. "You want me to tell a law firm I reviewed documents I never saw?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Then he said something that made the situation suddenly much clearer. "Danny, the investors are already committed." Committed, meaning the deal was already moving forward, and my name had been used to help make that happen. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that mattered most. "How much money are we talking about?" Ethan hesitated, and hesitation usually means the number is bigger than you expect. Finally, he said it. "About 12 million. $12 million. I closed my eyes for a second, because suddenly the entire situation felt very different. This wasn't just a startup exaggerating projections. This was a funding structure where my professional reputation had been quietly inserted into the paperwork. And if something inside those numbers wasn't real, the consequences wouldn't just hit Ethan, they could hit me too. But what I didn't realize yet was that the investors were already starting to notice something strange inside those documents. And once they started asking questions, the pressure on Ethan's company was going to increase very quickly. Because when millions of dollars are involved, people don't stay calm for long. And the first sign that things were beginning to fall apart showed up 2 days later, when one of the investors called me directly. 2 days after that call with Ethan, my phone rang again. The number wasn't saved in my contacts. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something about the timing made me answer. "Daniel Brooks speaking?" For a moment, the man on the other end didn't say anything. Then he cleared his throat. "Mr. Brooks, my name is Richard Callahan. I'm one of the investors involved with North Harbor Technologies." That sentence immediately changed the tone of the conversation, because investors don't call compliance analysts randomly, not unless something inside the deal has started bothering them. "I hope you don't mind me reaching out," he continued, "but your name came up during our internal review this morning." Internal review. Those 2 words told me everything I needed to know. Investors had started double-checking the documents, which meant something inside the funding structure had already raised questions. "What exactly would you like to know?" I asked. Callahan didn't hesitate. "In the materials we received, you're referenced as the professional who reviewed the company's financial exposure." There it was again, that same quiet assumption, that I personally looked at Ethan's numbers and confirmed they made sense. "I haven't reviewed the project," I said calmly. The silence on the line lasted longer this time. When Callahan spoke again, his voice sounded very different. Not angry, more like someone slowly realizing a piece of information he had relied on might not be real. "I see," he said carefully. Then he asked the next question. "And just to be absolutely clear, you weren't involved in verifying the company's projections or funding structure?" "No," I said. Another pause. Then he exhaled quietly. "That's interesting." Interesting. In business conversations, that word rarely means something good. It usually means someone just discovered a problem. "I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Brooks," he said finally. "We're simply trying to confirm the information we were given." I understood exactly what he meant. Investors don't like surprises, especially when millions of dollars are involved. Before ending the call, Callahan asked one more question. "When was the last time you spoke with Ethan about the project?" "2 days ago," I replied. "I see," he said again. Then he added something that made my stomach tighten slightly. "Well, I suspect we'll all be speaking with him very soon." The call ended a few seconds later. I sat there staring at my phone because the situation had just moved into a completely different stage. Until that moment, the problem had only existed between me and Ethan. Now the investors were involved, and once investors start questioning financial documents, things can unravel very quickly. I tried calling Ethan again. This time he didn't answer. Not once, not twice, not even after the 4th call, which told me something important. He was probably already dealing with the investors, or worse, trying to convince them everything was still under control. But financial confidence is a fragile thing. Once people start doubting the numbers, they rarely stop asking questions. And that evening, while I was finishing work and preparing to leave the office, I received a message that confirmed the situation was escalating faster than Ethan expected. It wasn't from Ethan. It wasn't from an investor. It was from a law firm. And the subject line of the email said something that immediately made the entire situation more serious. "Urgent clarification required," which meant the lawyers had now officially stepped into the problem. And when lawyers start asking questions about $12 million, things rarely stay quiet for long.
The email from the law firm arrived at 6:18 that evening. I was already packing my bag to leave the office when the notification popped up on my screen. The sender was a firm called Harrington & Cole Legal Group, a name I had never heard before, but the subject line was impossible to ignore. Urgent clarification required. The message itself was short, professional, but the tone underneath it was unmistakable. "Mr. Brooks, our office is conducting a routine review related to investor documentation submitted by North Harbor Technologies. Your name appears in multiple sections of the financial compliance summary. We would appreciate confirmation regarding your involvement." Multiple sections. That phrase immediately made the situation worse, because it meant my name hadn't just been mentioned casually, it had been used repeatedly throughout the investor documents. I opened the attachments. There were 5 files: risk summaries, compliance notes, financial exposure explanations, and in each one, there it was again. Daniel Brooks, compliance review reference. Not a signature, not an official certification, but something almost as powerful. A suggestion. The kind that tells investors someone qualified has already checked the numbers, except the numbers had never been checked, at least not by me. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen, because at this point the problem wasn't just about Ethan exaggerating a pitch, it was about legal exposure. If those documents were used to convince investors to move money and something inside the company later collapsed, people would start asking who reviewed the risk, and my name would be sitting right there inside the paperwork. That's when my phone vibrated again. Ethan, finally calling back. I answered immediately. "What did you tell them?" he asked the moment I picked up. Not hello, not how are you, just that question. "The truth," I said. There was a sharp breath on the other end of the line. "Danny, you didn't have to do that." That sentence actually surprised me, because it meant he already knew the investors had spoken to me. "You used my name inside legal documents," I replied. "What exactly did you expect me to do?" "Just keep it simple," he said quickly. "This is normal for startups. Investors need reassurance." Reassurance? That word sounded dangerously close to something else. Misrepresentation. "Ethan," I said carefully, "how many investors have already seen those documents?" He didn't answer immediately, which told me everything I needed to know. Finally, he spoke. 6. 6 investors, at $12 million total funding. That meant each one had probably committed a serious amount of money, and every one of them believed a compliance professional had looked at the company's financial structure, except that professional didn't exist. "Danny," Ethan said suddenly, his voice softer now, "you don't understand. If the investors lose confidence now, the whole company collapses." That might have been true, but the real question wasn't whether the company would collapse, it was whether the structure holding it together was real in the first place. "Ethan," I asked quietly, "did anyone else review those numbers?" He hesitated, just for a second, but that second told me something I didn't want to hear. "No," he admitted, and suddenly everything became clear. My name hadn't just been used for credibility, it had been used because there was no one else behind the numbers. I rubbed my forehead slowly, because now the situation had become far more dangerous than a simple startup exaggeration. This was a $12 million funding round built on financial projections that no one had actually verified. And once lawyers started asking questions about those documents, the investors would start asking even bigger ones, which meant Ethan's company was about to face a level of pressure he probably never experienced before. But what neither of us realized yet was that one of those investors had already decided not to wait for the lawyers, because the very next night, someone knocked on my apartment door, and the person standing outside wasn't Ethan, it was one of the investors. The knock on my apartment door came at 9:12 the next night. Not the kind of knock friends use. This one was firm, confident, the kind of knock someone makes when they already know exactly who they're looking for. I checked the door camera. A man in his early 50s stood in the hallway. Gray hair, dark coat, the calm posture of someone used to being in control of serious conversations. I opened the door halfway. "Yes?" He gave a small nod. "Daniel Brooks." "That's me." "My name is Richard Callahan," he said. "I'm one of the investors involved with North Harbor." The moment he said that, the entire situation shifted. Investors don't visit people at night unless something inside the deal has started worrying them. "May I come in?" he asked. I hesitated for a second, but refusing wouldn't solve anything, so I stepped aside. Callahan walked into the living room slowly, looking around the apartment like someone organizing his thoughts before speaking. Then he turned toward me. "I'll be direct," he said calmly. "This morning, our legal team informed us that you were not involved in reviewing the financial structure of North Harbor Technologies." "That's correct," I said. He studied my face carefully. "And yet, your name appears throughout the investor documentation." "Yes." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed quietly. "Mr. Brooks, you understand why that concerns us." Of course I did. When investors believe professional verification exists, they rely on it. If that verification disappears, confidence disappears with it. "How much have you invested in the company?" I asked. Callahan didn't answer immediately. Then he said something that made the situation feel even heavier. "Just over $2 million. $2 million from one investor, which meant the $12 million funding round Ethan mentioned earlier was probably accurate." Callahan walked toward the window and looked out at the city lights. "For 6 months," he said slowly, "we were under the impression that someone with compliance experience had reviewed the company's financial exposure." He turned back toward me. "And now we're learning that may not be true." I didn't try to soften the answer. It isn't. Another silence. But this time it felt different, not tense, more like the quiet moment when someone finishes connecting the final piece of a puzzle. "What exactly did Ethan tell you about my involvement?" I asked. Callahan gave a small, tired smile. "He said you had reviewed the financial structure early in the process and confirmed the risk levels were reasonable." Confirmed. That word carried a lot of weight, especially in front of investors deciding whether to move millions of dollars. "I never confirmed anything," I said. Callahan nodded slowly. "Yes,
that's becoming clear. He reached into his coat and pulled out his phone. We spoke with the lender this afternoon, he continued. They've already paused the next release of funds. Paused. That single word can destroy a startup, because companies like Ethan's depend on scheduled funding. If one payment stops, everything behind it starts collapsing. Employees, contracts, construction. Every delay costs money, sometimes enormous amounts of it. Your brother called us earlier today, Callahan said. He assured us the situation with your name was just a misunderstanding. Of course he had. That's what people do when they're trying to keep a fragile deal alive. They call it a misunderstanding. But financial confidence is fragile. Once investors start doubting the structure, they rarely stop asking questions. Callahan slipped his phone back into his pocket. Mr. Brooks, he said quietly, there's something else you should know. I waited. Tomorrow morning, he continued, all the investors are meeting with Ethan. That alone wasn't surprising. Investor meetings happen all the time. But the next sentence made the situation much more serious. And we've asked the legal team to review the entire funding structure. Entire, meaning every document, every claim, every assumption. And once lawyers start reviewing paperwork connected to $12 million, things can escalate very quickly. Callahan walked toward the door, but before leaving, he stopped. One more question, he said. When was the last time you looked at Ethan's financial projections? I shook my head. I never have. He nodded slowly. I suspected that might be the answer. Then he opened the door. Tomorrow morning is going to be interesting. Interesting. Another one of those polite business words that usually means trouble. After he left, I stood there for a moment thinking about what he had said. Because if the investors were reviewing the entire funding structure tomorrow, that meeting could decide the future of Ethan's company. But what I didn't realize yet was that Ethan had already prepared his own version of the story. And in that version, I wasn't the person exposing the problem. I was the person causing it. Which meant when those investors walked into the conference room the next morning, they were going to hear something about me that I wasn't expecting. And that's exactly what I walked into when I opened the conference room the next day.
The investor meeting started at 9:30 the next morning. I arrived a few minutes late. Not intentionally, but when I stepped into the office building lobby and saw the elevator doors closing, something inside me told me to slow down, because whatever was happening upstairs wasn't going to be a normal meeting. When the elevator finally opened on the 12th floor, the conference room was already full. 6 investors, 2 lawyers, and Ethan standing at the head of the table beside a large screen showing financial projections. Through the glass wall, I could see him talking confidently, calm, controlled, the exact same posture he had used 6 months earlier during the original pitch. For a moment, I stayed outside the room, listening. One of the investors leaned forward and asked a question. Ethan, we've been told that the compliance review attached to these documents may not have been completed. The room went quiet. Everyone looked at Ethan, and for a brief second I expected him to admit the mistake. Instead, he smiled, not nervously, confidently. "That's a misunderstanding," he said. Then he turned slightly and pointed toward one of the documents on the screen. The compliance input came from my brother, Daniel Brooks. My stomach tightened, because that sentence made it sound like I had already confirmed everything. One of the lawyers spoke next. "Our office reached out to Mr. Brooks yesterday," he said carefully, "and he indicated he had not reviewed the financial structure." Another silence filled the room, this time heavier, more uncomfortable. But Ethan didn't panic. If anything, he leaned forward slightly. "That's because Daniel only looked at an early draft," he explained. "He's being cautious now because he didn't formally sign anything." Cautious.
The way he said that word made it sound like I was simply stepping back from something I had previously supported, which wasn't true. And the investors around the table looked uncertain. Some of them glanced down at the documents. Others looked at Ethan, trying to decide which version of the story made more sense. That's when one of the lawyers asked the question that changed everything. Then perhaps Mr. Brooks should clarify that himself. The entire room turned toward the door, and that was the exact moment I stepped inside. Every conversation stopped instantly. Ethan's eyes locked onto mine. For the first time since this situation started, his confidence faltered, just for a second. Then he forced a smile. "Danny," he said. The way he said my name sounded almost relieved, like he believed my presence would somehow solve the problem. One of the investors gestured toward the empty chair at the end of the table. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "we were just discussing your involvement with the company's financial verification." I sat down slowly, because I already understood what Ethan was hoping would happen next. All he needed was one sentence, one small confirmation that I had reviewed the numbers. The investors would relax, the lawyers would close their files, and the entire funding structure would continue moving forward. But there was a problem with that plan. The numbers inside those documents had never been verified. Not by me, not by anyone. And if I confirmed something I hadn't actually reviewed, I wouldn't just be helping Ethan, I'd be attaching my professional credibility to $12 million worth of risk. The lawyer looked directly at me. "Mr. Brooks," he said calmly, "can you confirm whether you reviewed the financial structure of North Harbor Technologies?" The room went completely silent. I could feel Ethan watching me, waiting. The investors were watching too, because the answer to that question would determine whether their money remained in the deal. For a moment, nobody moved. Then I finally spoke, but the words I said next were not the ones Ethan was expecting. And the moment those words left my mouth, the entire meeting changed. The room was completely silent. 6 investors, 2 lawyers, and Ethan standing at the front of the table waiting for me to confirm the story he had already told. The lawyer repeated the question. "Mr. Brooks, can you confirm whether you reviewed the financial structure of North Harbor Technologies?" I looked at Ethan. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then I answered, "No." Just one word, but it landed in the room like something heavy hitting the floor. The reaction was immediate. One of the investors leaned back in his chair slowly. Another closed the folder in front of him. Across the table, one of the lawyers began writing something down. Ethan didn't speak right away. He was staring at me. Not angry, more like someone who had just realized the plan he had been relying on was no longer working. "Danny," he said finally, forcing a small laugh, "you're being too careful." Too careful. The way he said it made it sound like I was simply protecting myself from a technical detail. But the lawyer interrupted him. "Mr. Brooks," he said calmly, "to be absolutely clear, you had no involvement in verifying the company's financial projections or funding structure?" "No," I repeated. This time, the silence in the room felt heavier, because now the investors understood something important. The professional credibility they believed existed behind the deal didn't actually exist. One of the investors looked at Ethan. "Is there another compliance analyst who reviewed the projections?" he asked. Ethan hesitated, just for a second, but that second was enough. "No," he admitted, and suddenly the mood in the room changed completely. Because until that moment, the investors believed the company had been reviewed by someone with experience evaluating financial risk. Now they knew it hadn't. The lawyer closed the folder slowly. "In that case," he said, "we will need to reevaluate the documentation submitted during the funding process." Reevaluate, another polite legal phrase.
But everyone in that room knew what it really meant. The deal was now under scrutiny. One of the investors rubbed his forehead. "How much of these projections have actually been verified?" he asked Ethan. Ethan tried to recover quickly. "The numbers are solid," he insisted. "We just haven't completed the final compliance review yet." But the problem was, confidence had already started disappearing. And in business, confidence is everything. Once investors start doubting the structure behind a deal, money begins moving very quickly in the opposite direction. Another investor spoke next. "If these projections haven't been independently verified, we need to pause the next funding release." Pause. That word hit Ethan harder than anything else said in the meeting. Because startup companies survive on funding schedules. If one payment stops, everything behind it starts collapsing. Employees, contracts, operations. Every delay costs money, sometimes enormous amounts of it. Ethan looked around the table. "You can't do that," he said. But the truth was, they already had. One of the lawyers nodded. "Until the documentation is fully reviewed, further investment will be suspended." Suspended. And just like that, $12 million of financial momentum stopped moving. The room fell quiet again. But this time, the silence felt very different. Because now everyone understood the same thing. The credibility holding the deal together had just disappeared. Ethan slowly turned toward me. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. But the truth was, I hadn't done anything except tell the truth. And once the truth entered the room, the entire structure Ethan had built started collapsing. But the worst part for him was that this meeting wasn't actually the end of the problem. Because once lawyers start reviewing financial documents connected to millions of dollars, they don't just stop with the funding deal. They start asking bigger questions. Questions about how those documents were created in the first place. And as the meeting ended, one of the lawyers said something that made the situation even more serious. "We will also need to review how Mr. Brooks's name appeared in these documents." That sentence changed everything. Because now the problem wasn't just a failed startup deal, it was a legal question. And legal questions connected to millions of dollars rarely disappear quietly, which meant Ethan's problems were only just beginning.
After the meeting ended, no one left the room immediately. That alone told me how serious the situation had become. Normally, when investor meetings finish, people stand up quickly. They shake hands, they check their phones, they leave. But this time, everyone stayed seated. The lawyers were quietly reviewing the documents again. The investors were speaking in low voices with each other. And Ethan stood near the window, staring out at the city like someone trying to understand how everything had shifted so quickly. Finally, one of the lawyers closed the folder. "Mr. Carter," he said, looking directly at Ethan, "we'll need copies of the original documentation used during the investor presentations." Ethan nodded slowly. "Of course." But the lawyer continued, "And we'll also need clarification regarding how Mr. Brooks's name appeared within those materials." There it was again, that same question. How did my name get there? The answer to that question mattered more than Ethan probably realized, because if the investors believed the reference to me had been misleading, the situation could move from a failed investment to something far more serious. One of the investors spoke next. "Ethan, when exactly did Daniel review the financial model?" Ethan hesitated, which was the worst possible thing he could do, because hesitation in front of investors rarely inspires confidence. "He looked at some early projections," he said finally. I didn't interrupt, but the lawyer did. "Mr. Brooks," he said, turning toward me, "did you review any version of these projections?" "No." The word landed heavier this time, because now the lawyers were asking the questions, and lawyers tend to listen very carefully to answers like that. The lawyer wrote something down in the file. Then he looked back at Ethan. "In that case," he said calmly, We will need to determine how the compliance references were included in the investor materials. Determine, another quiet legal word, but everyone in that room understood what it meant. Investigation. Not a courtroom investigation, not yet, but the kind that starts with paperwork. Emails, timelines, authorization chains, the small details that reveal how financial documents were created. Ethan rubbed his hands together nervously. "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding," he said. One of the investors gave a tired smile. "That's what we're all hoping." But hope isn't a financial strategy, and the atmosphere in the room had already shifted too far for simple explanations. The lawyer gathered the documents and stood up. "Our office will begin reviewing the materials this afternoon," he said. Then he added something that made Ethan's situation even more complicated. "We may also need to review communication records related to the investor presentations." Communication records. Emails, messages, phone calls, anything connected to the funding process, which meant if Ethan had ever written something suggesting I verified the financial structure, the lawyers were eventually going to see it. The meeting finally ended a few minutes later. The investors left first, quietly. No arguments, no dramatic reactions, just the slow, uncomfortable exit of people who had suddenly realized their investment might not be as secure as they believed. Ethan and I were the last two people still standing in the conference room. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he finally turned toward me. "You didn't have to say it like that," he said. His voice wasn't angry. It sounded tired, like someone watching months of work slip away. "I told the truth. That truth just cost me $12 million, he said. But the reality was the money had never actually been secure in the first place, and deep down, Ethan probably knew that, because deals built on confidence alone rarely survive real scrutiny. He grabbed his jacket and walked toward the door, but before leaving, he stopped. "There's still time to fix this," he said quietly. I didn't answer, because once lawyers start reviewing financial documents, fixing things becomes much harder. Ethan left the room a few seconds later, and as the door closed behind him, I looked down at the stack of documents still sitting on the conference table. My name was still printed across several pages, a small line at the bottom of a financial summary, just a reference, but that reference had helped hold together an entire funding structure, and now that the truth had been spoken, that structure was starting to collapse. But the real consequences of that collapse wouldn't appear until a few weeks later, because when investors lose confidence, they don't just walk away. They start asking what really happened, and sometimes those questions lead to places no one expected, including Ethan. Over the next 2 weeks, everything started changing. At first, the changes were small, quiet, the kind of things only people inside the company would notice. Investor calls became shorter, emails from the legal team became more frequent, and the atmosphere inside North Harbor's office slowly shifted from excitement to tension. Ethan didn't call me during those first few days, not once, which told me something important. He was busy trying to repair the situation, trying to convince the investors the deal could still survive, trying to reassure them the numbers were still strong. But confidence in business works like glass. Once it cracks, it rarely returns to its original shape. The first real sign that things were falling apart came about 10 days later. One of the investors withdrew, quietly. No dramatic announcement, no argument, just a short email explaining that the firm was reevaluating its position. That single decision removed nearly $2 million from the funding structure. In the moment that happened, the rest of the deal became unstable. Because startup funding works like a chain, each investor expects the others to remain committed. If one link breaks, the entire chain starts weakening. A few days later, another investor paused their commitment. Then the lender delayed the next release of capital. and suddenly the entire financial schedule behind the company started sliding backward. Employees noticed the change quickly. Construction on the new development platform slowed. Hiring plans were quietly canceled. Meetings with potential partners were postponed, and inside the office, people started whispering. No one knew exactly what had gone wrong, but everyone could feel that something had. About 3 weeks after that meeting in the conference room, I received another phone call. This time, it wasn't from a lawyer, and it wasn't from an investor. It was from my mother. "Daniel," she said the moment I answered. Her voice sounded tense, more emotional than usual. "I just spoke with Ethan. I already knew what that meant. He told me everything that happened at the investor meeting." Of course he had. But I also knew something else. People rarely tell their families the entire truth about situations like this. "What exactly did he tell you?" I asked. She hesitated. Then she said something that sounded painfully familiar. "He said the investors lost confidence because you refused to help him." There it was, the version of the story Ethan had decided to share. Not that he used my name without permission, not that the documents suggested verification that never happened, just that I refused to help. For a moment, I didn't say anything. Then I asked a simple question. "Did he mention that my name appeared in the legal documents?" Silence. A long one. "No," she admitted finally. That didn't surprise me, because the real story was far more complicated than the version Ethan wanted people to believe. "Mom," I said calmly, "those investors believed I had reviewed the company's financial structure." "But you did look at it," she said. The way she said that told me Ethan had simplified the situation dramatically. "I saw a presentation once. It's very different from verifying financial projections." She sighed heavily. "You know how important this company is to him." Yes, I did. But importance doesn't change the rules behind financial responsibility. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said something that made the entire situation feel even heavier. The company might not survive this. That possibility had probably crossed Ethan's mind many times during the past few weeks, but hearing it spoken out loud made it feel real. Because once investors start leaving, companies rarely recover. And if North Harbor collapsed, Ethan wouldn't just lose the funding, he would lose the reputation he had built in the startup world. But what my mother didn't realize yet was that the collapse of the company wasn't the final consequence of what had happened, because the legal review that started after the investor meeting was still continuing. And when lawyers review financial documents connected to millions of dollars, they don't just look at the funding structure, they look at everything. Emails, messages, authorization chains, and eventually, they reach a conclusion. One that determines whether the situation was just a failed business deal or something much more serious. And about a week later, that conclusion finally arrived in the form of a letter addressed directly to Ethan. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, not by email, not through a phone call, but by certified mail from the legal office reviewing the investment documents. Ethan called me that same afternoon. His voice sounded different. Not angry, not defensive, just tired. "Daniel," he said quietly, "I received the report." I didn't ask what it said, because I already knew the lawyers had spent weeks examining every detail connected to the deal, every document, every message, every investor presentation, and lawyers rarely spend that much time investigating something unless the stakes are high. "What did they conclude?" I asked. There was a long pause on the phone. Then he said the words slowly. "They determined that the financial model presented to investors contained references implying independent verification that never actually happened," which was exactly what I had said in the meeting weeks earlier. But hearing it confirmed by lawyers made the situation very different, because now it wasn't just a disagreement between two people, it was a documented finding. Did they say I was responsible for that? He asked. No, I replied honestly. They said the language in the documents created that impression. And impressions matter a lot when millions of dollars are involved, especially to investors. Ethan exhaled slowly. They're recommending the investors terminate the deal. That meant the company was finished. Without the funding, North Harbor couldn't continue the expansion it had promised, and without that expansion, the company's entire valuation collapsed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan said something unexpected. I shouldn't have used your name. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't emotional, just a simple sentence spoken quietly. I thought it would help reassure them, he continued. And once the deal started moving forward, I didn't know how to correct it without damaging everything. That's the strange thing about decisions made under pressure. Sometimes people tell small half-truths, believing they will fix the problem later, but later rarely arrives the way they expect. Why didn't you just ask me? I said. He gave a short laugh, because I knew what the answer would be. He wasn't wrong. I would have said no. Not because I wanted the company to fail, but because financial verification isn't something you attach someone's name to casually, especially when millions of dollars depend on it. The conversation ended a few minutes later, and that was the last time Ethan and I spoke about the company. A month after that call, North Harbor officially shut down its expansion project. The remaining investors redirected their capital to other startups. Most of the employees moved on to different companies, and the deal that had once looked like the next big success story quietly disappeared. A few weeks later, my mother called again. Her voice sounded calmer this time. He's starting something new, she said. He learned a lot from what happened. Maybe he did. Failure can be a brutal teacher, but sometimes it's the only one people actually listen to. As for me, I kept working exactly where I had been before, reviewing compliance structures, checking financial documentation, making sure the details behind big promises actually held up under scrutiny. Because the truth about business deals is simple. Investors don't just invest in numbers, they invest in trust. And once trust breaks, even the most impressive plans can fall apart. All it takes is one line in a document that shouldn't have been there.